Hi Jamie, this is Carly. I'm going to be showing you my digital poster presentation today. My presentation is over the corruption of capital punishment in the United States. So we're going to go ahead and start with the basics. First, capital punishment is currently used in 24 states. It's slowly declining in popularity. Over time, folks are starting to dislike the death penalty and are slowly starting to want to get rid of it. So it's a good sign, but it's been a really slow process over the years. The approved methods of execution are lethal injection, electrocution, lethal gas, hanging, and firing squad. Lethal injection is currently the primary method of execution across the US. There are some states where different methods are available. I know that in Tennessee, in particular, electrocution is available for folks whose crime and sentence happened before 1999. But for everybody else, lethal injection is their only option. It just depends on the state. Um, so, a botched execution happens when the execution does not go as planned due to an unforeseen technical or medical issue. And what this essentially means is that something goes wrong and the person survives their execution, whether it be for a few minutes or if they have to stop the process altogether, which has happened before. Um, there, a botched execution is when something goes wrong technically or medically. Maybe the person didn't respond to the drugs how the people thought they would. Maybe they had some problem with the equipment, but it means that the person survived basically for any amount of time. Um, According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 3.15% of executions get botched, and 7.12% of all lethal injection executions are botched. And those don't seem like very high numbers, but to break it down into human people, like out of every 100 executions, 3 of those people suffer a botched execution. And usually, the botched execution the result is pain and suffering for the person being executed. We'll talk more about that later, but of all the methods of execution, lethal injection is definitely the one that gets botched the most. That's 7 out of every 100 people who get executed by lethal injection survive or suffer or do not take in the lethal cocktail as expected by the people administering it. So here's my citation here. And we're going to move on to theological support for abolition of the death penalty. So in Matthew 25, Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and the goats. Here he tells his followers that how they treat other people is literally how they are treating Jesus. Whatever they did for the least of these, they did for Jesus, and whatever they did not do for others, they did not do for Jesus. So I'm going to read those verses really quick. Verse 40 says, "The king will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And in verse 45, he says, he will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. And so, Jesus' parable here, he's basically telling his followers that how you treat other people is how you're treating me, literally. So it's very, it should be very normal for us to look at the most despised in society and for the marginalized and the outcast. And as Christians, look at them and see Jesus and see the love that God has for these people, and we should be reminding ourselves that we are not God and we do not have the power or the right to judge somebody else. We do not have the ability to condemn or forgive sins. All we have is the ability to follow God. And when we condemn people to death, we are not doing that. When we support capital punishment, we are not doing that. And when we condemn people to death, we're not showing mercy, we're not showing forgiveness, we're not bringing healing to a situation. Reparations aren't being made. The only thing that's happening is we're spending a lot of taxpayer money to get rid of somebody and to tell the world that this person is not worthy of our love, our resources, our respect, anything. It's completely the opposite of the mission of God to promote capital punishment. So, Jesus himself was murdered by the state of Rome. He knows what it's like to be the most hated in society, and he took that burden upon himself in order to save us. Jesus willingly became the most hated person in his society so that we could live. Um, and the reason, like, one of the reasons I'm so against the death penalty is because Jesus was there in that moment. Jesus was that person, and he experienced that, and he forgave the people on, he forgave the man on the cross next to him. And it's such a pure light example to us of how we should be treating the people that commit heinous crimes, and how we should hurt, and how we should be treating the people that hurt us. Not that um, this is not to excuse or in any way lighten the load of the crimes that these people have committed. This is simply to say, yes, they may be guilty, but they are children of God, and they are worthy of love and relationship and human dignity and human rights and respect. So, Pope Francis calls upon all Christians and people of goodwill to work for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, in all its forms. Death row is a place of isolation and despair. We have easy access to this information, and yet the Church ignores this significant issue, particularly the Protestant Church. The Protestant Church has unfortunately been a great proponent of the use of the death penalty. We have become numb to the suffering of God's children and taken it upon ourselves to judge people's sins. It shows incredible hypocrisy and pride within the church. We have taken it upon ourselves to discard the teachings of Christ and decide justice on our own. The ignorance and complacency displayed concerning capital punishment is an embarrassing failure of the church. And so this is just to point out the very stark difference between Catholicism, which outright, very blatantly rejects capital punishment, and Protestantism, which for some reason just pushes the death penalty. In fact, they're like a great proponent of, where like the Protestant church is a great proponent of the death penalty, unfortunately. It's very strange because of the weird dichotomy there is. Like, it's like we're ignoring Jesus' teaching when we promote the death penalty. It's like we're somehow trying to justify disobeying God when we promote the death penalty. It's very counter scripture, and it's very confusing to me why we still do this. But here it is. And here is the citation down here. Now we're going to move on to some of the annotated bibliography bit, and we're going to talk about Bays v. Rees, the Supreme Court case. So in this case, the Supreme Court decided that lethal injection, despite the alarming numbers of botched executions it produces, does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and therefore does not violate a prisoner's Eighth Amendment right to freedom from such punishment. They decided that death row inmates are not entitled to a painless death, but to the most humane execution modern technology is able to provide. Ironically, the primary method of execution in the United States is also the leading method in botched executions. So it was in like 2007 when Bays and Bowling brought this case to their state, and basically they were saying, look at all these botched executions. The Bays and Bowling were on death row and are still on death row today, and they were saying, look at all these botched executions that are happening. You can't do this to us. This is cruel and unusual punishment, which it totally is and should be considered such. But the Supreme Court essentially argued that they didn't have another way to execute them that was going to be painless or free of any suffering whatsoever. Um, and in order to carry out their sentence, they had to pick a method, basically. And lethal injection was the most humane way that the Supreme Court knew of to carry that out, even though, despite them, and these numbers have been available, but for some reason, the Supreme Court basically argued that it was the most humane method available. Um, Even though, according to this citation over here, um, electrocution actually has a much lower botch rate, which is not I have no claims or information on pain levels or suffering levels, but as far as just botched executions go, which often lead to pain and suffering, lethal injection is probably the most unsuccessful method of execution. And here's the citation for the Supreme Court case here. So now we're going to talk about the unseen cruelty of lethal injection. In December of 2020, Dr. Joel Zavat with the Emory University Hospital discussed his findings on the result of lethal injection with the Death Penalty Information Center. In the podcast, he goes into excruciating detail about what lethal injection does to the body. Dr. Zavat has found similar physical situations in hundreds of autopsies of executed prisoners. The article actually said that he's done over like 200 autopsies of executed prisoners. He found that fluid, blood, and foam fill the lungs when a person is given the lethal injection. Victims of the lethal injection feel excruciating pain and experience an invisible drowning. The reason people believe it to be a peaceful death is because it is invisible from the outside. It is more comfortable for witnesses today to see someone fall asleep than to be hung, shot, or electrocuted, even if any of those methods are more successful. The podcast likens lethal injection to death by torture. So, by the evidence found by Dr. Zavat, who is pictured down here, it is not painless. It is not peaceful. The person suffering the lethal injection experiences excruciating pain. And the only reason that we still use it, really, according to people like Dr. Zavat, is because it's more comfortable for the witnesses to watch. It there's a great lack of regard for the comfort of the prisoner. And while my stance is that we definitely should not be sentencing people to death at all, the ways in which we are doing it, if we have to do it, are also pretty disgusting. Um, just every aspect of capital punishment and its use in the United States is full of some sort of corruption, some sort of lying, some sort of violation of human rights. And it's evidence like this that really makes us question Supreme Court decisions like Bays v. Reeves. So, once again, this is the citation down here. Down here is a picture of Dr. Zavat and the logo from the Death Penalty Information Center. We're going to go ahead and move on to mental health and the death penalty. So, there are insufficient protections for people suffering from mental illness on death row. By law, a person cannot be executed if he cannot understand what he did or why he is being executed. When a death row inmate is found to be too ill to be put to death, there is no help or further protection for them. They continue to sit on death row until such a time that they can be legally killed. This is the tragic case of Raymond Riles, death row's longest held prisoner. He has been on death row for 45 years and has an extensive history of debilitating mental illness. His legal team is at a loss. If they get him help and he regains the soundness of mind to know his crime, he will be eligible again to be put to death. If he is left alone with his illness, he will live, but with whatever pain and suffering his condition may bring. Neither ending will bring healing or peace, and both possibilities are a clear and obvious violation of human rights. And here is a picture of Mr. Raymond Riles. And here's the citation below. So we're going to talk about Raymond Riles and his situation. It's heartbreaking, and this is just one example of the many people who are on death row experiencing mental illness and do not have access to help, because if they get help, they will be eligible again to be put to death. And it's heartbreaking because there's no healing option for them. It's harmful. Some may argue that it's torture. It's excruciating for the legal teams, for the loved ones. It's awful, and quite honestly, it's bad for the victims as well, because I mean they get to know that this person that hurt their loved one is behind bars, but their sentence can't be carried out, and that person is suffering. So there's just no healing aspect to this situation, and unfortunately, Mr. Riles is not the only one. Um, but he's been there for 45 years. Um, in the article, in this article from the citation, it discusses his past of mental illness. He's tried to kill himself in prison. Um, he he has no way of getting help and surviving, and it's heartbreaking, and it's not of God. And there need to be um, laws that prevent this kind of thing from happening. If a person is found to be too mentally ill to be put to death, they should be taken off death row. But unfortunately, in many cases, that is not the case. They sit there, and they have to sit there until such a time that they die in prison or they get better and can be executed. Um, so it's a very lose-lose situation for everybody. It's sad because the legal team doesn't know what to do about it. It's a very major ethical dilemma, and it's a very heartbreaking situation, and it happens to lots of people. So we're going to go down here to the possible solutions. My personal life goal is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolishing the use of capital punishment in any form and for any crime. I feel like that would be a miraculous victory. I dream about that kind of thing. I I believe that capital punishment is an abuse of power. It's an abuse of taxpayer dollars, because taxpayers do pay for capital punishment. Um, each death penalty case costs millions more than cases that do not seek the death penalty. It costs more to put someone to death than it costs to keep them alive in prison for the rest of their lives. It is a waste of resources, of life, and it's shameful. It's not. It's not right. It's really not right, man. So, state by state abolition victories are also wonderful. The most recent victory happened this month with Virginia's vote to abolish capital punishment. The next step would have to be providing more protections to former death row inmates, preventing situations like the one that Mr. Raymond Riles is in right now, transferring them out of death row and into prison population, and making sure they are not kept on death row. The reason I say this is because many states keep their prisoners on death row even if the death penalty is abolished in case the state repeals the law. And, so they keep them on death row for years and years and years, and they might be in solitary confinement for that long, even if there's no death penalty in the state, which is also really wrong. The next step after that would be fighting to forbid solitary confinement as punishment, as it is a form of torture. Um, uh, Solitary confinement is often used on death row to isolate death row inmates. And it leads to severe mental problems, suicide attempts, just great pain throughout um, among the people who have to suffer that. And solitary confinement is most certainly a form of torture. So those are the solutions. Once again, here are my citations and the little print down here. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.